This build is crazy powerful. It will allow you to run through raid bosses, champions, and mini bosses effortlessly. It's easily my favorite build to use in Grandmasters in Season 23. The gameplay behind me here is from the GM this week. Bungie recently did a rework of this exotic, and the changes are crazy, and we'll get to that in just a moment. First, let's do a breakdown of the subclass and everything we're using for this build. We're on Void Titan, and we're using Ward of Dawn. The class ability we're using is the Towering Barricade to block some incoming damage when necessary, and to give ourselves an overshield, which will increase our melee damage. Jump is Catapult Lift, and the melee is of course going to be Shield Bash because this is the one that ties in with Peregrine Greaves. For the grenade, we're going with Vortex Grenades, so that way we can debuff champions, tormentors, and bosses within the Grandmasters, or any activity for that matter. Now for the aspects. First up, we're going to be using Bastion, and the reason why we're using Bastion is because this is going to give us the easiest access to overshields. Overshields give us an added layer of survivability because of course we're not using Strand Titan that has Woven Mail. So for Void Titan, the replacement is Overshields and Devour. And if you actually play it right, it's almost as powerful, as you can see in some of the gameplay behind me here. The next aspect ties in perfectly with our first one, which is Offensive Bulwark. While you have an Overshield or are inside your Ward of Dawn, your grenade recharges significantly faster. You have increased melee range and damage, and melee final blows extend the duration of your Overshield. The key here is that while you have an Overshield, your melee will do more damage. And according to the Destiny 2 data compendium, this is a 100% increase in melee damage, which is going to make that Peregrine Greaves shoulder charge hit very hard. You'll notice that I'm able to successfully one-hit kill champions within a Grandmaster with this, with no additional help at times, as long as I set up everything correctly. So that's our gameplay loop with our aspects. Now we're going to jump into the fragments for this build. Now keep in mind that I will adjust these fragments based on the activity that I'm doing. So for example, in the Grandmasters, I'm going to be using different fragments than if I were to run this in normal strikes. And at the end of this video, I'll go over the exact fragments that I would use if I did run this in lower tier activities. First up for the fragments though, we have Echo of Obscurity, Finisher Final Blows, Grant Invisibility. The reason why this is nice is because if you lose your Overshield in the process of trying to push a champion and one-hit kill shoulder charge it, you might leave it very weak, and in doing so, you'll want to hit a finisher on it because you're standing there right next to it. And so you'll find yourself occasionally finishing the champions, and when you get that invisibility, it's just really nice for getting away, disengaging from the danger. And alternatively, if you want to go in and shoulder charge an enemy, you can get a finisher on any enemy beforehand, make yourself invisible, so that way you're not as easy a target for the enemies to shoot you, because obviously when you're in a Grandmaster, everything is extremely lethal. It only takes 1 or 2 shots for you to die. So invisibility is very key here, and easily one of the better fragments for this build when using it in the Grandmasters. The next one is going to be Echo of Undermining. This is going to add a debuff to any target that it affects, and keep in mind that it's the exact same amount as Revitalizing Blast offers in this season's artifact, so it's best to work with your teammates, assuming that they have some solar builds on, to use their solar abilities and debuff the boss. And then once that debuff runs out, then you can throw your Void Grenade and apply Undermining, which will be effectively the same debuff. This has just a ton of strong utility, and I highly recommend using this, even though it does take away -20 discipline, which does hurt. Moving on to the next fragment, we have Echo of Persistence. This will extend your Devour timer up to 15 seconds at maximum, which is really nice because inside Grandmasters, it takes a little bit longer to get kills on enemies, but with the maximum of 15-second timer, you can usually keep that timer going, which is going to feed you a ton of grenade energy and constantly replenish your health, which is effectively our replacement for Banner of War when using Void Titan as opposed to using Strand Titan. And on top of that, our Overshields and Invisibility will last longer, and we are utilizing all 3 of those abilities. So Persistence is very, very good for this. Lastly, we'll go with Echo of Starvation, which is picking up an orb, or a Void Breach will grant you Devour. This is going to be your main source of getting Devour if you don't have the new exotic sidearm from the dungeon, which is not entirely required for this build, but just is very fun. I'm talking about the Buried Bloodline exotic sidearm. I got the catalyst on it here. I was utilizing this in the Grandmasters, and no, not for a meme, it's actually pretty good. It ties in extremely well with any Void build because its main trait, Violent Reanimation, reads multiple final blows of this weapon, grant Devour to the wielder. So all I have to do is just shoot this sidearm, kill a couple red bar enemies, I get Devour. If I continue to kill enemies, I'll keep my timer up to 15 seconds, making it very easy to keep a high uptime on Devour, granting me more grenade energy and constantly keeping me alive. And on top of that, it has the ability to weaken on hit because of the catalyst, which means that I'm debuffing all the targets with a -15% debuff just by shooting them. So Buried Bloodline ties into this build very nicely, but it's not necessary by any means. Feel free to use a different weapon if you don't have this one. And the last thing I should mention is that this season has anti-barrier sidearm, which is really nice for the Buried Bloodline because it one-shots the barrier shields, which is also why I chose to use this for GMs. My primary weapon was the Fatebringer for this build, simply because there are unstoppable champions in there. The GM gameplay you can see behind me here is from Lake of Shadows. There's barriers and unstoppables. I wanted to be able to stun both champion types myself, so that way as soon as I stun them, them, I can go in there and hit them with a shoulder charge. And lastly, I went with a Briar's Contempt because it's Solar Surge, and this is one of the better weapons. But I have been hearing a lot of people talk about using swords against the boss. For me though, I found that Briar's Contempt worked, and we were successfully able to melt the boss on many occasions with it. Now let's get into all of the armor mods I have, starting with the helmet. For Grandmasters this season, and for the past few seasons as well, Heavy Ammo Finder and Heavy Ammo Scout is a must. You want to get heavy ammo as much as possible because you're running out of it, because champions suck up all your heavy ammo. Bosses, mini bosses, tormentors, you can never have enough heavy ammo in a Grandmaster, so Heavy Ammo Finder paired with Heavy Ammo Scout will allow you and your teammates to just constantly have a good replenish of heavy ammo. I recommend those two on pretty much every Grandmaster build in Season 23. Then I went with a Harmonic Siphon because I'm using a Void subclass, and I'm using Buried Bloodline, so that way I knew I would make a ton of orbs, which is going to proc Devour for me when I pick them up. Now moving on down to my Gauntlet and all of the mods I have on it. First up, I have a Harmonic Loader, and that's just to reload the Buried Bloodline a little faster. Then I went with Impact Induction, causing damage with my powered melee, reduces my grenade. Obviously, I'm causing a lot of damage with my powered melee. I'm going to be shoulder charging each and every champion, and in doing so, I'll get my grenades replenished a little bit more. And lastly, I went with Bolstering Detonation, which is going to give me class ability energy when I cause damage with my grenade, so that way I can get my Titan Wall back because I'm utilizing it before I go in and shoulder charge almost any champion, so that way I have an overshield that gives me increased melee damage. Now moving on down to the chest piece, I got Melee Resist on, Arc Resist because it's Arc Threat, and then I went with Solar Resist, but you can pick anything you want. Void Resist is just fine. Arc, Solar, and Void will do you really good as well. Since this is a melee oriented build though, and I am getting very close to enemies, I decided to put melee damage resistance on just to give me a little bit more added survivability, but you can pick whatever you like there. Now moving on down to the boots, we have the exotic Peregrine Greaves. These things are so good after the rework. They now read all shoulder charge abilities, deal bonus damage when activated in the air, damaging mini bosses, tormentors, or champions with your shoulder charge refunds your melee, provides a small benefit to the airborne effectiveness stat of all weapons. So all you have to do is run around and hit a shoulder charge while in air. It does take a little bit of a setup though, so keep that in mind. You got to give it some time sprinting. I want to say 2 to 3 seconds. So give yourself some decent distance when you're going to go up and shoulder charge a champion, a tormentor, or a mini boss, and then jump in the air so you see Peregrine Greaves Strike pop up in the bottom left. And then as soon as you hit them, you literally get your melee fully refunded back to you. And if you do whiff it, it only uses up a small percentage of your melee. It obviously works extremely well on champions. As you can see in the gameplay behind me, I'm able to one-shot them. On top of that though, it works on tormentors. In this Grandmaster, I was able to shoulder charge the tormentor like 5 or 6 times and mess him up. And Nezrak technically counts as a tormentor even though they are a raid boss, and you can successfully melt Nezrak with these exotic boots, as you can see in the gameplay clip here behind me. So these things are just a ton of fun, and I highly recommend using them. Now let's go through all the mods that I'm going to have on the Peregrine Greaves. First up, we're going to go with Innervation, which is reduce your grenade cooldown each time you pick up an Orb of Power. Normally I always have Recuperation on here, but for this build specifically, we have on the Fragment Echo of Starvation, which is picking up an Orb of Power, gives you Devour, so you don't need Recuperation. But one thing I should be clear about is that Devour doesn't give you full health anymore, so you can still slot in Recuperation here if you want. Like if you feel like you're picking up an Orb of Power and not getting enough health, you can definitely use this, but it's not entirely necessary. So I found myself going back and forth between Innervation and Recuperation, experimenting with the two, and for now I settled with Innervation. For the other two mods, I went with a Void Weapon Surge and a Solar Weapon Surge just to increase the sidearm and linear fusion damage, so that way I could melt enemies a little faster, keeping Devour procced up as much as possible, and when it came to time to do boss damage, I was able to melt the boss a little faster as well too. So that's why I picked those. Now moving on down to the class item, we're going to go through the mods we have here. Reaper, every time I place my Titan Wall down, the next weapon kill I get is going to make an Orb of Power. There's no timer on this too, so this is just really nice for making a lot of orbs, which obviously will proc Devour and tie into this gameplay loop very well. Proximity Ward is huge because if you're not invis when you do your finisher, this will allow you to successfully get that finisher off without being shot by the enemies nearby. This overshield is ridiculously powerful. And then of course, when your finisher is completed, you're going to be going invis, so this adds a really nice gameplay loop here, and I highly recommend using Proximity Ward whenever using Echo of Obscurity. I love that gameplay loop between the two there. And lastly, we went with Time Dilation, so that way our armor charge would decay a little bit slower, giving us an increase to weapon damage with our Void Surge and our Solar Surge. And that's it for all of the mods. Now let's go through the stats. Of course, we're in the Grandmasters. Everything is destroying us. We need 100 resilience. After that, the next most important stat would probably be some strength. Occasionally your melee might whiff, or you lose it due to Destiny being Destiny. So I did want some strength there, but it's not entirely necessary if you actually make sure to hit your melee on the champion each time. So alternatively, you could go with as much discipline as you could possibly afford. After that though, I would go with as much intellect as possible because it feels really nice to be able to get your bubble back fast. And then after that, recovery would be the next most important, followed up by mobility being absolutely unimportant for this build. Now let's break down the exact artifact mods that complement this build. Unfortunately, this season is much more oriented towards using solar weapons with a little bit of strand and a little bit of stasis, but for a void build here, you'd still want to make sure to have these two mods on from whence you came, so you do do a little more damage to Taken and Scorn, and then you will want Wished into Being, so that way it'll create some more orbs of power when you run out there and get those shoulder charge and grenade kills. So at least have those two on for this build. So that's the build that I'm utilizing in the Grandmasters this week to take on Lake of Shadows. And like I mentioned previously, 2 fragments that I would consider slotting on if I wasn't doing Grandmasters would be this one right here. Final blows when surrounded by combatants grant super energy. This is obviously going to be really nice because when you run in there and hit those Peregrine Greaves shoulder charges, you're going to be surrounded, and this is going to give you a boost to super energy. Also, I would utilize Echo of Leeching, which is melee final blows start health regeneration for you and nearby allies. This is also nice because it gives you plus 10 resilience. And a notable mention would be Echo of Exchange, which is melee final blows grant grenade energy. Those are all 3 options that I would use in low tier activities, but in the Grandmasters, these are definitely going to be the 4 best fragments. I spent hours using this build to help carry people, and if you want to get carried in the Grandmaster, make sure to follow my Twitch channel. Let me know your thoughts about this build down in the comments below. Smash the like button if you enjoyed, and click on the screen here to watch another video from this channel. And if you're feeling thirsty out there, make sure to use code LUCKY10p to save some money on G Fuel. Also, make sure you're following me on Twitch and Kick. I go live all the time playing Destiny 2. Lastly, make sure you're following me on X, Instagram, and TikTok, where I deliver Destiny 2 news to you daily. I appreciate all the followers out there.